In June of 1820, young portrait artist Chester Harding made his way from St. Louis toward the village of La Charrette on the Missouri River, some 55 miles west. Harding was in search of Daniel Boone. In 1820, Boone was 86 years old and already famous. A biographical account of his exploits during the settlement of Kentucky had been circulating in both America and Europe for over 30 years. When Chester Harding arrived in St. Louis seeking subjects for portraiture, the city's leaders urged him to seek out Boone and capture his likeness. Now, Harding was on his way. But surprisingly, as he stated in his account of the painting of Boone, the closer he got to Boone's dwelling, the less people seemed to know of the old frontiersman. When Harding finally reached La Charrette, he asked a man if he knew where Colonel Boone lived. The man replied that he didn't know anyone of that name. The man's wife interjected, "Why, yes you do. It is that wide-headed old man who lives on the bottom near the river." Harding later mused that it was a good illustration of the adage that a prophet is not without honor, save in his own country. At 28 years old, when Harding set off to find and paint Daniel Boone, the artist himself had already lived an unusually adventurous life. Born in western Massachusetts to a family of subsistence farmers, Harding had little schooling and little awareness of his artistic talent throughout boyhood. During his teens, his family relocated to the wilds of western New York State. Here, they built a log cabin and cleared trees to plant crops. Some years later, when the War of 1812 broke out, Chester enlisted as a drummer. His unit marched north to Sackett's Harbor, where many, including Harding, fell ill with dysentery. Discharged at the end of his enlistment, Harding returned home determined to find an easier way to make a living than cutting and clearing timber. Farming held little appeal for the budding creative. Following brief stints as drum maker, peddler, chair maker, tavern keeper, and house painter, Harding eventually found himself in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Now married and the father of a small child, he had found a measure of success as a sign painter, but he still struggled to make ends meet. An older acquaintance, a fellow sign painter, also painted portraits as one of his commercial offerings. Harding was intrigued and asked his friend to paint a portrait of both his wife and himself. The friend agreed, but he would not allow Harding to observe his painting technique or explain in any way how it was done. The finished works delighted Harding, and he became obsessed by them. He thought about them day and night and finally determined that he would attempt one himself. Using the colors and materials he had available from his sign painting work, he produced an image of his wife. Harding later wrote, "The moment I saw the likeness, I became frantic with delight. It was like the discovery of a new sense. I could think of nothing else, and from that time, sign painting became odious and much neglected." Harding's brother Horace was a chair maker and had relocated to Paris, Kentucky, a town near Lexington on the road to Maysville. Horace wrote to his brother and informed him that a portrait painter in Lexington was making $50 per head. Young Chester was incredulous, but as he thought more about it, he gradually determined to move his family to Paris, Kentucky. It was a fortunate decision, for it was in Kentucky that Chester Harding began his career as a professional artist. In his first 6 months in the Lexington area, he painted nearly 100 portraits at $25 a head. He later admitted that the first 25 he accepted unsettled his conscience a bit. He did not believe a portrait was worth that kind of money. Enjoying such success, Harding began to consider seeking formal training in his chosen occupation. He soon set his sights on attending the Philadelphia Academy of Design in Pennsylvania, but he would need a bit of polishing first. His wife, who had received a much better elementary education than Chester, worked with her husband to improve his reading and writing skills. At last, Harding spent 2 months in Philadelphia, drawing and painting in the academy and studying the finest works of art. Upon the artist's return to Kentucky, his funds were depleted, and the local economy was suffering a downturn. This had created a shortage of cash and made it difficult for him to receive payment for his work. Harding felt he had no choice but to relocate. But moving would take cash, and he had none. What he did have, left over from his earlier prosperous days in Kentucky, were a dozen silver spoons and a gold watch and chain he had purchased for his wife. Chester hawked them, and his family soon headed for Cincinnati. But finding few clients for portraiture in the young Ohio community, the Hardings ultimately landed much farther west in the well-established Mississippi River town of St. Louis. Harding arrived with letters of introduction. He presented one of them to General William Clark of Lewis and Clark fame, who was then governor of the territory. Clark welcomed the young artist warmly and even offered to sit for a portrait. This endorsement led to dozens of commissions for Harding. And it was no doubt Governor Clark, in company with other leading voices of the city, who later encouraged Harding to make the journey west up the river to find and paint Daniel Boone. Now, having been directed to Boone's location by the old couple in La Charrette, Harding headed toward the spot, eager to introduce himself to the famous pioneer and explain his purpose. Boone's dwelling turned out to be an old blockhouse near a creek behind his daughter Jemima's home. When Harding entered the cabin, old Boone was lying on his bunk by the fire, roasting a long strip of venison wrapped around a ramrod and seasoning the venison with salt and pepper. 86-year-old Boone was feeble. He had been feverish, and it took some time before he understood exactly what Harding was requesting, but he ultimately agreed to sit for the portrait. At times, he was unable to hold himself steady, so a friend occasionally stood behind him to brace his head and shoulders. The execution of the portrait required more than one sitting, and Harding noted that while Boone was untalkative at first, as sessions progressed, he began to speak freely about his many frontier exploits. A well-known Boone quote came from one of these later sessions. After Boone's description of one of his long hunts, Harding asked Boone if he had ever been lost having no compass. Boone famously replied, "No, I can't say as ever I was lost, but I was bewildered once for 3 days." Owing to Boone's poor health, Harding limited his work to a simple oil sketch of the aged frontiersman's head and shoulders. He would later copy and expand the work into a full portrait. When Harding finished, in his words, Boone was much astonished at seeing the likeness, and his many grandchildren were even more astonished at the picture than the old man himself. Daniel's children also admired the accuracy of the work, but his son Nathan regretted that Boone's cheeks looked sunken and not plump as they had been most of his life. This is understandable since at the completion of the oil sketch, the old man had less than 3 months to live. He would die peacefully in his son Nathan's home on September 26, 1820. Chester Harding would spend the remainder of the summer after leaving Boone roughly 100 miles farther up the Missouri River in the frontier town of Franklin. Here, he would rent a couple of rooms to use as a studio and adapt the Boone oil sketch into 2 finished portraits, the well-known half-length figure of Daniel Boone, and purportedly a full-length figure on an oilcloth. Only the half-length portrait is known to survive. Based in St. Louis, Harding enjoyed success as an itinerant portrait artist over the next couple of years. In 1823, he would move his family back to New England and satisfy a long-held ambition to visit and paint in England. His reputation preceded him, and English high society received him warmly. He spent a year producing likenesses of the country's elite. Harding would ultimately make Springfield, Massachusetts his permanent home, occasionally wintering in St. Louis and visiting England once again following his wife's death. Harding passed in the spring of 1866 during a stay at the Tremont House Hotel in Boston. He was 73 years old. In the course of his adventurous and celebrated career, the famed artist had painted dozens of luminaries in both the United States and England, and he is the only artist ever to have captured an image of Daniel Boone from life. Harding's original oil sketch of Boone found its final home at the Massachusetts Historical Society, where it remains to this day. While this original work has spawned many idealized images of Daniel Boone by other artists in the years since its creation, one image in particular might rival this original painting in its power and pervasiveness. That image is of a much younger Daniel Boone leading settlers through the Cumberland Gap into Kentucky. This work has become something of an icon of America's earliest westward expansion. The creator of the spectacular image was George Caleb Bingham, an artist raised in Missouri from boyhood. It's not well known, but there is an intriguing connection between Daniel Boone's portrait artist, Chester Harding, and George Caleb Bingham. When Harding left the Boone portrait sessions and traveled upriver to Franklin to convert his rough work into finished portraits, 9-year-old George Caleb Bingham just happened to live in Franklin at the same time. Indeed, the pre-adolescent Bingham ended up working as an apprentice to Harding during the creation of the finished Boone portraits. 31 years later, that eager young boy, then having become a renowned painter himself, would create possibly the second most famous image of America's most venerated frontiersman, Daniel Boone. And it was only fitting that he should do so. After all, he certainly knew the face. Well, folks, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. And please be on the lookout for our upcoming multi-part story of Daniel Boone's descendants in the American West. See you next time.